Three, two, one, action.
Well, let me tell you something, brother.
Hello, and welcome to what is a rather unorthodox episode of the Wrestling and Film Podcast, because I go solo. Yes, not solo Sokoa, just me going solo, going alone. There is no guest, there is no second opinion, unfortunately for you, just my opinion. But today we are going to deep dive, well, not deep dive, but we're going to dive into the Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary. Highly anticipated, hotly debated post-release, and yeah, it's been largely what I've expected, polarizing, and I think perhaps that was maybe the goal of the creators, was to create quite a polarizing documentary, because Vince McMahon is that. Everyone is in different camps. There's an in the middle that can accept good and bad. There's a bad Vince, and there's Vince is the greatest thing ever. But yeah, I wanted to deep dive into this because it's a massive wrestling in film project. The combination of wrestling and film, and now Netflix obviously has perhaps never been bigger with this documentary. I believe once upon a time I read that it was the most expensive Netflix documentary series. Whether that's still true or not, I don't know. But it was definitely a big one, and it left its mark in some way, shape or form. But today what I'm going to do, and my primary goal, is, in my opinion, give you whether I believe it worked or not, whether it succeeded or not. That's to an extent subjective. Obviously, I don't have all the answers, but from what I saw, what it gave, reactions, etc., I'll kind of do my summary of what I think. So this is Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary series, I guess you could say review. The Mr. McMahon documentary, obviously, as we know, directed by Chris Smith, who made the very popular, very world-swooping Tiger King documentary series. I remember when that came out, and it just, like I said, it almost took over the world. Everyone was talking about it. And of course, we also had Bill Simmons as the one of the executive producers, who, for wrestling fans, they may remember, was also part of the Andre the Giant documentary film, my apologies, from 2018, which was a great one, and was actually I believe, WWE kind of co-produced film, which I believe initially this Mr. McMahon documentary was going to be in some capacity, and then since the evolution, since Vince's obviously legal troubles, it's changed a lot. But nevertheless, a very stellar kind of creative force behind it. And of course, the unprecedented access of which they had Vince McMahon was unheard of. Like, no one's ever had this kind of access to Vince. The nature of the interviews, the intimacy involved in these interviews, how honest Vince appears, or as honest as he probably ever will be in his life. And some of even just the backstage things that they have, it's just, really, really fascinating stuff. So that package kind of made it impossible not to get excited about. The overview of the whole series, I would say, is very much as much as you can and as effectively as you can in 6 hours, which I think they did a very good job of. It's the career and life of Vince McMahon. It's, episode 1 is very much his upbringing, and, his then eventual relationship with his father, how he got into wrestling, taking over the WWE, etc., etc. And they go for key points. Obviously, him taking over WWE, creating WrestleMania, going mainstream, eventual kind of battles with kind of legal cases that kind of came in the 90s, rape accusations, the eventual lawsuit, the steroid trial that kind of came, and that almost put him behind bars, the screw job, the Attitude Era, which obviously was the next renaissance in professional wrestling, where Vince also became an on-screen character, And then the kind of intertwining behind the scenes kind of relationships, particularly with his family, Shane McMahon, Stephanie McMahon, Triple H, obviously, of course, Bret Hart, things of that nature, are all kind of front and center as well. So as far as, and of course, the very, very end, Benoit's tragedy leading to the present day of the lawsuit and Vince exiting WWE. As far as how they encapsulate everything, I think it's it's very well done. It's brilliantly done, because it's a tough thing in 6 hours, more or less, to kind of capture everything this man has been involved in, good or bad, is very, very challenging, because Vince has been at the heart of wrestling for, God, the better part of like 40 odd years, if not longer. And yeah, to encapsulate everything that this guy has been involved in, like I said, good or bad, is an incredibly tough thing to do. And I think they were never going to be able to win with it. And also, we had to remember that they were going to cater to a much larger audience. This is a much larger audience. This is not just professional wrestling audiences. This is not just on the WWE network. This is Netflix. And this is a mainstream, big-time Netflix documentary, which has to touch a much bigger audience. So I understand what they did, kind of going through those early stages, going through those kind of prominent moments, as well as some less known stuff, which is, I guess, more the present day things, because they're fresh. So for wrestling fans, I would say that the initial first 4.5 episodes, you could argue that they're not quite what you're looking for, in the sense of, if you're talking about what we want something fresh, probably not. I will say there were moments in that, in those first 4 episodes, where I was like, yeah, just kind of nodding along. I know this, and it was nothing breathtaking, nothing captivating. However, that being said, there was always nuggets within those episodes, and then also just the nature of Vince's interviews, and like I said, the sincerity of those interviews took me aback and always kind of had me locked in. And even if I agreed with what Vince said or disagreed, or whether also the supporting cast, which was stellar, Rock was speaking, John Cena, Bret Hart, you have, the prominent wrestling journalists over the last, 30 odd years. So there was always interesting nuggets to keep you hooked, and there was different perspectives. There was sometimes also things that people have never said before or never admitted to, e.g. Hulk Hogan admitting to kind of ratting out Jesse Ventura when they tried to create a union in WWE to go against Vince McMahon. So yeah, there was, like I said, there was always stuff there. However, largely as a diehard wrestling fan, you could argue there was a lot to be, I don't want to say desired, but there was a lot that you could kind of skip over a little bit, because it's been done. However, you have to understand that, like I said, it's made for a larger audience, and I've heard reactions from others. Like, for example, there is a friend of mine who is a casual fan, and him growing up with the Attitude Era, that particular episode on the Attitude Era and kind of what came from that time period and how that's now perceived nowadays, etc. He found that fascinating, and it was also very interesting for me. However, for him, it was a bit fresh still. There was things he didn't know. So yeah, it was interesting to hear those perspectives, because I think wrestling fans, me being one of those, of course, can get boxed down to what we want, but it has to be bigger than that, because they're catering to not just us, but they're catering to a larger audience. So I understand those key points, and I understand the rehash, because it was very necessary in order to get the impact for the final episode. And that's speaking not just as for the viewers who have to catch up with the history, but that's also as a viewer who knows the history, recapping that history and getting to that final episode, which is the new stuff, the legal suit, really enhanced that final episode for me. So storytelling, and as far as how this documentary is pieced together, one cannot, I think, argue the quality of it. It's very, very tight, very concise, very slick, and very intelligently edited. There's plenty of moments that now in hindsight, knowing that all the interviews done with Vince were, I think, pre him leaving WWE the first time and pre, like, allegations, legal suits coming into play. So knowing that and hearing some of the stuff that Vince said now and then knowing what was coming was almost like chilling. Vince was essentially foreshadowing and he didn't know he was. Like the biggest thing being Vince talks about, it's the very end of the episode, I believe, or one of the episodes, I can't remember which one, and Vince talks about the different minds he has, like almost in the way he processes different things. And he said, there's one part of my mind that is thinking about sex, essentially, and kind of wanting that stimulated, that kind of desire stimulated. And it was just in this end part of the episode, and we know what's coming. And it's just, it had such an effect that I couldn't, it was chilling and it was frightening. And I was like, you know. Of course he didn't know what was coming, but yeah, it was scary. And there were moments like that. And oddly, then there are moments that have become very, very emotional. Like the way they dissect the relationship with Shane McMahon. Although we know things about Shane seeking his father's approval and things of that nature, the manner they dived into it and the emotion behind Shane getting a pat on the back from Vince after returning and wrestling Undertaker. Really, really fascinating stuff. And there are so many, like I said, little nuggets. Paul Heyman's story about Vince telling Shane, you have to kill me to take this company from me. And all those things, they're just fascinating. So even when we're going over stuff, you're all, as a wrestling fan, you're always going to get little nuggets of things that you'd never knew or you find very fascinating. And you cannot help but be engaged by what Vince is saying, whether you agree or disagree. It's just, it's fascinating. And for non-fans, as I've been hearing, like I said with my friend who watched, who talked about the Attitude Era episode, and I had some colleagues of mine who also have kind of started watching it. I had a friend of mine text me, and he's like, "Oh, you should watch the Mr. McMahon documentary. It's right up your alley." Little did he know I'd really binge watched the whole thing. But they're people who are not as engaged, not as well versed in the wrestling history, and they're captivated by this, this crazy madman who is a genius on one hand, which the documentary paints and applauds, but is also almost disturbed and, very, very questionable on the other hand, which again the documentary highlights. And I think Dave Meltzer said it, I believe. I'm going to have my notes here just to kind of remind me. I think Dave Meltzer said something along the lines of that people in one capacity or another will not be happy with this documentary. They're either for the pro-Vince camp, they're going to think that this documentary is too negative, whereas the anti-Vince camp are going to think that this documentary is too positive. And he was right in that instance, I think. And I think Dave said that himself, that's kind of been the reaction. So, did it work? Did the Mr. McMahon documentary succeed? Obviously, to an extent, the answer to the question is subjective, because it's art. It's people have differing opinions. Of course, the wide audience, people are going to come at it from different perspectives, very knowledgeable to not knowing a thing, and depending on where you stand there, your opinion will vary. But I think, like I said at the beginning, this was a polarizing subject. This was likely always going to be, and probably the desire was for it to be, a polarizing documentary. And I think if that was the goal, it 100% succeeds. Because regardless, again, whether you're a fan or not a fan, I think you will have these varying opinions of this just fascinating subject, and this crazy individual who, like I said, on one hand is a genius, on the other hand, perhaps quite disturbed in with things that have happened in his life and that he's now potentially done later in life. So polarizing for sure. So if that was the goal, 100% succeeded. I believe the initial viewership that came out, Netflix, according to Netflix, the documentary enjoyed a strong first week as it pulled in 4.9 million views, ranking at number 4 on the most watched list, which I'm not sure where Netflix stand on, whether that was very successful, whether they wanted more, but that sounds like a pretty solid entry. I imagine, obviously, it's just going to grow over time. So, as far as numbers, it sounds solid. It sounds, as far as post-documentary kind of discussion, there's been a lot of it, and there's been a lot of eyeballs, a lot of discussion, a lot of debates, and that's, I guess, for a documentary, probably one of the best things to happen, because it's not a film where you just want to be entertained. There is an element of that, but in a documentary, obviously, it's more informative, and this is very informative, and whether you're, like I said, a wrestling fan or not, you can take a lot away from it. But speaking purely as a wrestling fan, some of a wrestling historian, it's that final episode. But the impact that final episode is only felt and enhanced with the recap and the little nuggets that come before. And kudos to the team for that, because I think no matter, like I said, where you stand, you'll always be engaged in the documentary, even if you heard things before. And perhaps that's tells you there that it did work, and it was successful in a lot of ways. And I can't say I wouldn't recommend it. I think no matter who you are, I would recommend it, because I think you'll take something away from it, and it's a fascinating subject. So if you haven't, check it out. If you have seen it, please let me know what you think, because, like I said, a wrestling fan or not, I'm very, very curious to kind of get a broader reaction to it. But I have not said certain things because I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't seen the documentary. But yeah, it's a fascinating insight, and I think probably, especially at the stage of Vince's life now and everything that's going on, probably the closest we'll ever get to knowing the man beyond the promoter and the performer. It's probably as real as we're ever going to get, and you're never going to get as much broad insight into who he is from all the people closest to him as you will in this. So congratulations to Chris Smith, to Bill Simmons, and to all involved. It's fascinating, and I think for me, in a lot of ways, yes, I understand the complaints, but in a lot of ways this works and is a fascinating documentary. So check it out.